If anybody wants a copy, we'll give it to them. I think Floyd's got a copy, I got a copy, Sean's got a copy. So this is, don't go along as, I haven't read it yet, but talking to Cletus, it don't go along some things that I have taught is that we can worship God on another day besides the Lord's Day. So study it. This is a subject that really needs in deep study. The Bible's right, and one of them is right, one of them is wrong. So we got to decide which one is right and which one is wrong. Yeah. Yeah. Scripture, but the Bible's right. Bible. Yeah. Yep. That's what. That's right. Right. But it's an Old Testament example for us. You know. Yeah. Yeah. But okay. Hebrews 10:25 and 26. Not forsaking the assembly of ourselves together as the manner of some. Now the assembly, that's one assembly. As manner of some is, exhorting one another so much as we see the day coming. Okay. The assembly ourselves together, this is the first day of the week assembly, because we see that it comes together for communion, and it comes together, lay by and store, we come together, sing praises to one another. We see examples where Paul preached at midnight, so they gathered together to break bread in Acts 27, and while they're together, Paul preached to midnight. So this is where we get preaching, and then praying. They've always as prayed. So either there's 5 steps of worship, or they're not. If you got 5 steps of worship, then that's one worship. Then I was taught is that if you get away from the assembly on the first day of the week and get away from the day, as you say, approaching, then it turns into private worship and corporate worship.
What about the people that's bedfasters, homebound, can't get out on the first day of the week?
God is always...
Is there worship in vain?
God, we talk about this, phantoms, sickness, war, does not change God's scriptures. God does not, we serve a God that does not punish us for things that we can't do. That's why that we are a blessed people. God don't require us to do anything that we can't do. So if you're sick, then you're sick. You're exempt. You know, if you're homebound, you're homebound. That means we can go visit and everything. But either there's a private net, when you, like I say, when you get away from the Lord's assembly on the day, now you can get in, if you can, now correct me, I mean, you know, we're here today, that's why the Bible study is for, to be in one accord and go with the scriptures like Cletus says. But I cannot find in the Bible where there's a private worship and a corporate worship. Now, a private worship is if you can worship God praying, then that's private worship. Then they say this right here is a corporate worship, that we're worshiping God and we're here to study the Bible, not to worship God.
Our prayers at home is not worshiping God.
Well, if it's private worship, if there's a private worship, yeah.
All right, we'll keep doing it.
Hey, can I read 26 too at this point?
Yeah.
For if we sin willfully, after that we have received the knowledge of the truth, there remains no more sacrifice for sin. So see, we're here in Bible study that we might receive the knowledge of the truth. And after we do that, we have to obey the truth.
Right.
Or else we'll be sinning willfully,
We'll separate from God.
and there's no more sacrifice left.
Right.
So this is very important.
Very important. That's what we was talking about going back 3 or 4 weeks ago about lay by and store. Everything that we deal with lies in the balance of heaven and hell. I mean, it is in front of the Bible, like we have discussed a lot. It's in front of the Bible in Deuteronomy. It's in the middle of the Bible in Proverbs. And it's at the end of the Bible. It's the punishment of adding or take away from God's Word. And this is what we're here studying and trying not to add or not to take away, is just see, thus says the Lord, you know. Go ahead.
You mentioned 5 somewhere. What's the 5 you're talking about?
Well, the 5 is you.
I don't mean to name each individual 5. What's the title of the 5? What do you call the 5?
Well, that's like we mentioned last week. We found the plan of salvation by studying, now wait a minute, by studying the Bible. Right? We found how the Spirit and truth is Ephesians 4:4-6, one Lord, one body. We know that. That's the unity of the Spirit. That's Spirit. Now the truth, Spirit and truth is how God has laid out for man to worship. Now, as we study the Bible, we find out that, does anybody in Hebrews 2:25, that's not the assembly that the early church done? Hebrews 10:25. Is that the assembly of the church in the first century? Is that the assembly of the saints?
Yes.
Okay. All right. The day approaching, do we all agree that's the Lord's Day?
Yes. That's the Lord's Day.
Okay, so that's the Lord's Day, and we understand how strict. This is why I say let's study, and we ain't going to fall out about this because we all want to go to heaven, you know. Christ said He's the Lord of the Sabbath. How strict was the Sabbath day?
That verse, last verse. Oh, wait a minute. I lost it. Well, they died by. He that verse 28. He that despises Moses' law died without mercy under 2 or 3 witnesses.
Okay, that's how.
Serious.
That's serious. Because how serious it is, how come sticks cause a man to lose his soul? Sticks.
Disobedient.
Disobedient. disobedient because God said, them is my sticks and it's my day. And I've commanded Moses what we do in the old covenant. All right? We fast forward here to the new covenant, and that's the one we are under, and how much more punishment or how much serious it is when we come on this side of the cross the Lord's Day. It's much more serious than the Sabbath, you know. And if you, and we know is that the Lord's Day is a special day, right? Because Christ arose on the first day. He showed himself together with the disciples on the first day. He ascended on the first day. The church was started on the first day. So this first day, the Lord's Day, is very, very important. And if you can assemble, we can't assemble on any other day and take communion. We can't assemble on any other day to lay by in store. You know. And Guy Woods, it's a real good commentator. Guy Woods says, if you haven't got the authority to assemble, to take communion on any other day, you haven't got the right to assemble on any other day except the Lord's Day and sing and admonish one another on the Lord's Day. We sing, they come together on the Lord's Day, they come together, they sung hymns and admonish and teaches one another. That's on the Lord's Day. So that goes back to what we say, and then, like we say, preaching, Paul preached, and then prayer. So we find out what the Spirit is, because we are a spiritual child, and we know you cannot worship God unless you're spiritual, unless you've been added that Christ is a spiritual church, and you're a spiritual. Oh, excuse me.
Luke 12:47 talks about it. It goes along with it. Is the Lord's Day is very important. It says that the servant that knew the Lord's will decided not to do it, and it says he was beaten with many stripes.
Yeah.
Because he forsook what the Lord said, and the Lord said not to forsake the assembly.
Well,
I agree with that 140%.
okay, so this.
4:17 says, "Him to no good doeth not, to him sin."
Right. So what I'm standing on, worship, like I say, if you can worship on a Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday, you are making the Lord's Day a common day, and I will not do that. I will not teach that.
Quite a distance from the mark, but I still like to know what you call those 5 items.
Worship. Worship.
So are you calling them acts of worship?
Acts of worship. Acts of worship
In
that.
that paper that you got that he had, you'll find in there, and if that's so, each time you do one of those things, you are worshiping. Wait a minute,
No, go ahead.
because it says in that paper, worship, the word worship, and there's 2 or 3 words that are defined as three that were defined as worship in there. And it says each one of those 3 are verbs. When we started out basically in grammar school, we learned that a verb is an action word. So therefore,
Yeah.
It's praying in action.
Yeah. Sing is action.
So why, if I'm acting when I'm praying, and I don't mean falsely, I mean in spirit and truth, praying, why is that not an act of worship?
That's part. Now, that's where it's just where it's a part.
Anything about worship being separate
In the Old Testament, and we'll fast forward to the New. In the Old Testament, praying never was considered worship. Never was. Daniel, when he was in captivity, looked towards Jerusalem and prayed 3 times a day. That wasn't worship because he couldn't worship. All right? You know. Prayer has never by itself been determined worship. Singing by itself, except in James 5:7, if you marry at the individual, let him sing. But praying comes down, if praying is worship, then you got a private worship.
Well, what about Jacob leaning on his staff when he says he
That's Jacob.
worshiped God?
That's Jacob.
I'm pretty certain that was acceptable to God.
Yeah. That's a Jacob.
Well, that's Old Testament.
Well, that was fit.
If you might guess, he could pray just by himself.
Well, couldn't have been by himself. I mean, I don't know the story. That's in Timothy. Where's that? Well, anyway, that was Jacob. Jacob lived and died under the old law. We're under the new law, the spiritual law, and we have got to worship God, or anything we do, we got to have authority on this side of the cross to do. And prayer.
things in the Old Testament are examples that we can learn by, right?
Right.
So in the Old Testament, did they sacrifice when they worshiped?
It's part of their worship. We go back to the greatest example there was Abraham. And we talked about,
I know what you're going, but what I'm saying is sacrifice worship in the Old Testament.
well, that was part of it. Yeah. Part of worship. Yeah. It wasn't all of it, because you had grain offering and you had fruit offerings.
The way I see, what I see the Bible saying, the Old Testament in that respect is no different than the New Testament, because sacrifice in the Old Testament was an act of worshiping God.
Yeah.
In the New Testament, when we pray, we are sacrificing, because in the New Testament it will say clearly the sacrifice of the fruit of your lips.
That's
Not talking about prayer.
12. Yeah.
Prayer? Okay.
Well, where at?
Prayer, is that not worshiping to God?
Not by itself.
Can I answer the where at thing?
Yeah. Where at?
Where at?
Yeah.
Where at?
Yeah.
In Hebrews 12, verse 23, to the general assembly.
That's the General Assembly. The first day assembly.
Now, the word church, correct me if I'm wrong, is a called out assembly.
Right.
Yeah, that's Christian.
That's us.
That's us. To the general assembly and church of the firstborn, that's Christ,
Right.
church of Christ, which are written in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the just men, now just men, made perfect.
Right.
That's in the general assembly.
Yeah.
There's the ones that God judges to be just and perfect.
Right. The ones that got the authority to worship Him.
Yeah, that's when.
Right.
That's when. The general assembly.
Right. And so, when you're praying, if you're praying by yourself to God, say that is, I'm not saying it is worship, I'm saying if it's worship, that is a private worship. That's where there's a teaching out there, there's a private worship, that you can hang out clothes and worship God. You know. And if you're hanging out clothes and worship God, that's a private worship. And then it turns into corporate worship. I have never in the Bible have read private worship and a corporate worship. I've always read in spirit and truth. That's how you worship God. Do what? Huh?
Can you do anything in private, in spirit, and in truth?
Yeah, because obeying God. Yeah. But that don't constitute. We've seen the private and corporate worship. If everything's worship, praying, worshiping, singing is worshiping, and we're singing and praying is worship, then where does vain, ignorant, and will worship comes in? Now there's three.
In vain they worship, being teaching doctrines.
Of man, doctrine of man.
Any ignorant worship is vain or ignorant.
Well, vain,
According to Scripture, that ain't vain or ignorant.
ignorant and will equals vain. I mean, excuse me.
11:21, it says, by faith Jacob, when he was dying, he fled both the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning upon the top of his staff. My guess he was praying to God,
That's right.
and he was worshiping God.
Well,
We can't.
Says he was.
That's Old Testament worship.
I understand that.
Old Testament worship. We're in a spiritual worship. Go ahead.
maybe we didn't understand that verse that I read. It says, to the general assembly. Okay, it's assembly now.
That's the assembly.
The church of the firstborn.
Yeah, that's the church.
Watch now, which is written in heaven and to God. The assembly worship goes to God.
Right,
It's recorded in heaven.
right.
And God is the judge of all. Talk about spirit and truth. Spirits, plural there,
Yeah.
spirits.
That's us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
An assembly.
Assembly.
More than one, not
Right.
not private.
No, right.
Excuse me, where you at, Tom?
In Hebrews chapter 12, verse 23. And what does that do? It makes just man made perfect.
Perfect.
Made perfect. I don't
Yeah.
know about you, but that's what I want to be.
That's
Perfect.
right. You know.
Yeah.
And God has never had multiple worships to Him.
No.
Never. God has never had multiple worships to Him. In all three dispensations, He has never had two or three different ways you could worship Him.
You just got to agreeing with him that when the man was leaning up on his thing, he was worshiping, and you told me a while ago that sacrificing was a part of worshiping, and there's no indication whatsoever that that man sacrificed. Were there certain steps in the Old Testament to worshiping that they had to complete before they had worship?
Where you had the worship, as I understand it, through the Old Testament, only place you could worship God, is ready to go, Ryan?
Somebody wants to hear the truth, get up and go.
Yeah.
Some of them didn't show up.
Yeah.
Well,
That's easy put.
there that verse,
You got that right.
the verse that I was reading there, it's talking about New Testament. It's the church of the firstborn.
Firstborn.
That's on this side of the
We're gonna see Sunday morning,
Okay.
Lord's Day.
Lord's Day. That's correct. I mean,
That's what I'm saying.
if,
Okay, watch now, and to be made perfect, we had to be assembled.
right. If you want to be approved by God.
Yeah, that's what
Right.
I'm talking about. He's the judge of all.
But back to our prayer. If you're praying by yourself, is it not private worship?
Anything you do by yourself is private.
Private worship,
It's private now. I mean, anything
You know.
you do by yourself is private.
right?
Depends on how you define private. Because if it is just personal, it's, that would be, to me, private. But if it's between you and God, it's no longer personal, and therefore it's no longer private.
Well, to me, when you worship's got actions. Every,
It's got actions,
you know,
therefore, why
and
can each act we do, that's defined in God's word, be an act of worship? Just like when it says, sing with the
because when they come together on the first day of the week, we find out what they've done. And Tom has read that what makes it perfect worship to God is when he comes assembled together to
denying that the acts that they do on the first day of the week are acts of worship. And also, I'm not saying that there are certain things we're commanded to do on the first day of the week that we're not to do at other times. There's even certain people that are commanded to do certain things that other people are not. But that don't change each act that we do being an act of, being an action or an act of worship. It
Yeah.
being plural.
That's part. I'll go back. That's the part of worship that God has